Art is a great way to explore themes such as stress, trauma, and grief and process those feelings, but it's also a great way to get in touch with your shadow self. Today we're going to be taking a look at chiaroscuro as an artistic technique, but we're also going to be taking a look at Jungian shadow work and exploring themes that often bring out our most raw emotions. Chiaroscuro is not just a technique. It's also about digging deep into the creative psyche and getting in touch with sometimes raw and uncomfortable emotions. Chiaroscuro, from Italian chiaro, light, and scuro, dark, is a technique employed in the visual arts to represent light and shadow to define three-dimensional objects. It's about using an abundance of darkness and using light sparingly to enhance depth and mood. But today we'll explore it through the light and dark of our conscious versus unconscious mind and why it matters on your creative journey. I hated reading Crime and Punishment in high school, but even as I look back on all the literature that I loved or loathed throughout the years, that was one book that seemed to arouse a disproportionately strong response. The book, if you didn't have to read it, is about an impoverished young man who ends up murdering a pawnbroker and her half-sister with an axe. Afterward, he spirals throughout the novel, struggling with his conscience until he eventually turns himself in. It isn't until the end that he comes to terms with his own shadow. In short, Crime and Punishment is known as one of the greatest works of the psychopathology of guilt written in any language to date. It wasn't until years later after reading the works of Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung that I figured out why I had such a strong revulsion toward Crime and Punishment. Throughout my time in the Army, I became intimately aware of what Carl Jung calls the shadow self, and we'll get into that shortly. But it's in times of crises that we get to see that shadow side of ourselves or our unconscious urges, and that can range from violence, wrath, lust, appetites, and so on. But for today, to explore chiaroscuro and Jungian shadow work, I'm going to use an author that I used to loathe, which was Fyodor Dostoevsky, the author of Crime and Punishment. And we'll get into the different themes as to why you should be choosing uncomfortable topics to explore and what that does as an outcome in the end for the creative process. Our shadow self, as defined by Jung, lives through our unconscious mind, aspects we've denied in ourselves, everything that our ego refuses to acknowledge but we see in others. This includes sexuality, impulsiveness, violence, intuition, fear, recklessness, desire, passion, greed, and our deepest, darkest thoughts that often invoke guilt or shame. Our shadow self often plays out in what we project into the world if we're not cognizant of it or refuse to recognize it. Jung warned that someone who is unconscious of themselves acts in a blind, instinctive way and is in addition fooled by all the illusions that arise when they see everything that they're not conscious of in themselves, coming to meet them from the outside as projections upon their neighbor. The shadow self is also likened to Freud's breakdown of the unconscious mind, which is covered in a past post on resilience building in the description box below. It's essentially a part of our minds that's repressed, from sexual drive to anger. In dreams, the shadow self plays out in ways that highlight fear, aggression, sex, and many other aspects of our minds that express our base emotions and desires, things that we might push away in our awakened conscious state. But much of our shadow self, our unconscious mind, is not just about negative traits. They also house positive aspects of ourselves that we've rejected. The inability to acknowledge our shadow self impedes personal growth and often manifests as projecting insecurities onto others. The answer is to get to know our shadow self, what we're repressing, and think about what causes us to lash out the most. Our shadow self is everything our ego is rejecting, and often shows up mirrored to us in everything that arouses strong emotion. The denial of the shadow self is a rejection of everything we've judged as unacceptable about ourselves. And if you allow it to go ignored, it continues to grow until it's acknowledged. Becoming conscious of the shadow self insists on a brand of personal courage to face what makes us uncomfortable and bring it into the light. Because the shadow never disappears, and so long as we keep trying to repress it within feigned positivity, it only grows to balance out the ego's act. If you take the time to explore your shadow self, delve into what arouses strong emotions within you without judging yourself, you give yourself the opportunity to achieve a sense of wholeness and the opportunity to genuinely see it in others. Pain and suffering are inevitable human experiences. At some point in our lives, we have what's referred to as a dark night of the soul, so to speak, where we experience the depths of loss, trauma, grief, and sadness. However, in those moments, as well as the uncomfortable aspects of the shadow self ranging from fear to lust and desire, we can tap into a well of creative inspiration as well as confront our fears in the process. Are you ready to explore that? I know it took me a while to figure out how to channel emotions like anger, and today we'll do just that through chiaroscuro and needle pointillism. Through comprehensive long-term shadow work, which is covered extensively in the book Existential Kink by Dr. Carolyn Elliott, we can transmute our deepest fears and desires into creative works of art. She states, even those in the functional adult camp with relatively mild addictive tendencies often find that despite their best efforts and intentions, dark patterns repeat in their lives. Before you can reach a sense of self-actualization and live authentically, it's important to explore all aspects of the mind instead of repressing or self-rejecting. The shadow self provides refuge for much of our inner turmoil and unexpressed emotions. When neglected, the shadow self becomes somewhat of a victim, a saboteur, an addict, a perpetrator. The list goes on. And the more we ignore it, the more it festers and expands. However, the shadow self is also filled with positive aspects, talents, and strokes of artistic genius. Like Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. In my opinion, you're not going to make a lot of creative breakthroughs until you go through the process of exploring everything that's gnawing at your psyche. To channel the negative aspects of our personality, we must first bring them into our waking consciousness. Accepting that we are both light and shadow, fear and love, and all the dualities that appear to be in constant conflict. When we accept the positive and negative that exists within all of us, we can then learn to stop self-sabotaging and be more compassionate with ourselves and others. Jung asserted that negative feelings are imperative to our psychological well-being and cannot be repressed without stifling creativity, joy, and wisdom. The shadow self houses all the emotions and inner conflicts that impede our growth, and when we consciously choose to acknowledge this part of ourselves, we also choose a path of fulfillment. The shadow self has the power to open new creative doors, and Jung believed that we need to meet our shadow self when experiencing a crisis, and many people choose to sidestep the accompanied introspection. Like a thick fog, the shadow self expands like the nothing from the never-ending story when left unattended. But when we choose to examine our shadow, inner turmoil dissipates. By shining a light into our deepest, darkest fears and desires, we give way for true self-love and love for others. Not a bad deal in the end, right? For the demonstration, I'll be using chiaroscuro and a bit of what I call needle pointillism for that oh-so-wonderful shadow self effect. You'll need a dark piece of paper or color it in accordingly to create a face or figure, cardboard, white paper, and a needle or other sharp-pointed object to make holes in the paper. But before you turn into Mayor McStabby, please do not try this without expert assistance of an arts instructor who specializes in these mediums. For the demo, I'm using the Crime and Punishment author Fyodor Dostoevsky as my reference. You can choose anything or anyone to draw out with chiaroscuro, but be sure to choose a subject that invokes a strong response. First, you layer the chiaroscuro sheet on top of the white paper. Then tape it to the cardboard with masking or painting tape. Use a sharp object like a needle or compass to puncture holes in the shaded regions. As a side note, be careful not to puncture holes too close together or the paper will start to fall apart. Once completed, remove the tape to reveal the other side of your shadow work. Here's a demonstration. When we poke holes in our ego, or the mask that we wear and present to the everyday world, we then can take an honest inventory of our shadow self. In turn, we can gain an intimate understanding of the roots of our fears, desires, and motivation. For me, it's been constant work. It wasn't until I got to a point in my own therapy where I expressed much of my deep-seated anger and repressed emotions that I thought I had already worked out long ago. I thought I had already expressed so much, but your shadow always has surprises. After intensive therapy that focused on extracting much of that unconscious anger, I got to experience a creative catharsis, the strongest and most productive I've had in years. And the real crime and punishment for all that time was being a prisoner to that anger for so long. When we express what makes us uncomfortable, the parts of ourselves that we tend to block out, we then make room for all the good fluffy stuff that we consciously say that we want. And we also accept ourselves for being human beings with both flaws and talents. I hope this helped you on your journey today, and in the meantime, take care, stay safe, and I will see you next time in the studio.